October 1st, 1854. 3 o'clock in the morning. Dowagiac, Michigan. The whistle cuts through darkness and frost settles on the platform of a town barely 10 years old. 46 children step down from the Michigan Central Railroad, ages 7 to 15, wearing donated clothes that don't quite fit. Their shoes scrape against wooden planks. Some clutch Bibles handed to them at Grand Central Station. Most have traveled for days in converted freight cars with makeshift benches and a bucket for a bathroom. The youngest ones cry. The older ones, street-hardened boys who've slept in hay barges and brewery cellars, scan the waiting crowd with calculating eyes. An agent named E.P. Smith, exhausted from the journey, arranges them in a line. By sunrise, they'll stand in the Presbyterian meeting house while farmers inspect their teeth and feel the muscles in their arms. 15 will be selected by day's end. 8 will be sent onward to Iowa City when no one chooses them. One boy, added without authorization from an Albany railroad yard somewhere between New York and here, will disappear into the rural Midwest with no record of his origin. This is the first train. 75 years and 200,000 children will follow. The orphan train movement represents the largest child migration in American history. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 children were transported from crowded eastern cities, primarily New York, to rural homes across 45 states, Canada, and Mexico. The Children's Aid Society alone placed over 100,000. The New York Foundling Hospital sent 70,000 more. Dozens of other institutions participated. This was not a government program. It was private charity operating at industrial scale, moving 3,000 to 4,000 children annually at its peak, with virtually no regulation, no standardized legal framework, and minimal follow-up. Some children found loving families and became governors, judges, successful farmers. Others were worked as unpaid labor, abused, shuttled between multiple households, or disappeared entirely into the American landscape with no one tracking whether they lived or died. The movement pioneered concepts that would become modern foster care, but it also operated as a massive social experiment conducted on the bodies of poor children, disproportionately the sons and daughters of Irish and German immigrants. The children themselves had no choice in the matter. Many didn't know they were leaving until the train departed. Some were genuinely orphaned. Others had living parents who surrendered them temporarily during economic crisis, only to lose them permanently when charities refused to return them. This is the documented history of what happened when Protestant reformers decided that the best solution to urban poverty was to empty the cities of children and distribute them across the West like seed corn. The evidence exists in annual reports, court records, indenture agreements, contemporary newspaper accounts, and the testimonies of survivors who spent decades searching for separated siblings. The story is neither redemption narrative nor simple condemnation. It is what the records show. New York City in 1854 had a population of 500,000. 30,000 of them were homeless children. Contemporary observers called them street Arabs, a reference to nomadic wandering. Police used the term street rats. Charles Loring Brace, a 26-year-old minister recently graduated from Yale Divinity School, called them the dangerous classes. He meant it as sociological description and political warning. In his 1872 book of that title, 448 pages published by Wynkoop and Hallenbeck, Brace wrote that there existed a potential explosion from this class which might leave the city in ashes and blood. He had witnessed the poverty firsthand. In 1852 and 53, he worked at 5 Points Mission, one of the most destitute neighborhoods in America, and at Blackwell's Island Almshouse. He wrote a regular column for the New York Times titled "Walks Among the New York Poor." What he documented was a humanitarian catastrophe produced by the intersection of mass immigration, industrialization, epidemic disease, and an absolute absence of social safety net. Between 1840 and 1859, immigration increased sixfold compared to the previous 2 decades. At peak periods, 1,000 immigrants per day flooded into New York. 40% were Irish, fleeing famine. 32% were German. They arrived with nothing and crowded into tenements with sanitation so inadequate that New York had the highest death rate of any major city in the world. Tuberculosis killed over 5,000 people per year in the 1880s and 90s. Cholera, typhus, and typhoid swept through the immigrant wards regularly. Working-class children entered the adult labor force between ages 6 and 15. Over 3,000 children, 2,000 of them girls, ages 8 to 16, were trained to theft because they had no other way to survive. Police Chief George Matsell's 1849 report identified over 10,000 vagrant, idle, and vicious children roaming the streets. By 1854, that estimate had risen to 34,000. They slept in alleys, over heated grates, in hay barges, old boilers, and brewery cellars along 10th Avenue, an area Brace called Misery Row, the main seedbed of crime and poverty. Some had families but preferred the street to overcrowded, disease-ridden tenements. Others were genuinely abandoned. Parents died in epidemics. Fathers drank themselves to death. Mothers succumbed to tuberculosis or childbirth. Children as young as 5 were sent to adult jails. The existing institutional response was inadequate. Large congregate orphanages warehoused children in grim conditions. Houses of refuge mixed juvenile offenders with hardened criminals. Brace believed all institutional care stunted children's development. He proposed instead a radical solution, articulated clearly in his writings. The best of all asylums for the outcast child is the farmer's home. Send them west where land was abundant, labor scarce, and Christian farming families would, in his view, transform these children into self-reliant citizens through gainful work, education, and wholesome family atmosphere. It was simultaneously humanitarian impulse and class-based social engineering. Brace believed in prevention over intervention, save children before they become criminals, remove them from corrupting urban influences, place them in Protestant rural homes where they would learn the values of hard work and moral discipline. The solution was emigration at scale. February 1853. 9 men, including Charles Loring Brace, founded the Children's Aid Society. Brace, at 26, became secretary and director, a position he would hold for 37 years until his death in 1890. The organization's mandate was explicit. The first annual report stated they had sent off to homes in the country or to places where they could earn an honest living 164 boys and 43 girls, total of 207 children in the first year alone. Of these 200 boys and girls, a great proportion are so many vagrants or criminals saved, so much expense lessened to courts and prisons, so much poisonous influence removed from the city. Funding came from wealthy philanthropists. Mrs. William Astor gave $50 in 1853. The Roosevelt, Astor, and Dodge families became major donors. Charlotte Augusta Gibbs, wife of John Jacob Astor III, had sponsored 1,113 children by 1884. Railroad companies offered discounted or free fares for the charitable work. The Children's Aid Society developed multiple programs: lodging houses for homeless newsboys, industrial schools teaching trades, reading rooms, kindergartens. But the signature innovation was the Placing Out program, later renamed the Home Finding Department, and finally the Foster Home Department. The mechanism was straightforward. Agents identified children from the streets, from surrenders by destitute parents, from magistrate orders. They gathered groups of 30 to 40, gave them new clothes and a Bible, and put them on westbound trains. Meanwhile, advance agents traveled to destination towns, placed advertisements in local newspapers, organized committees of respectable citizens, clergymen, doctors, newspaper editors, to screen prospective families. The trains arrived. Children were displayed in churches, opera houses, theaters, or on depot platforms. Prospective parents inspected them, sometimes examining teeth and muscles like livestock evaluation. Selection happened quickly, often within a day. Families took children on 90-day trial periods. The society retained the right to remove children from unsuitable placements, and children were supposed to remain until age 18 for girls, 21 for boys, at which point boys would receive $100 to $200. Most arrangements were indentures, not legal adoptions. This distinction mattered. Adopted children gained inheritance rights. Indentured children did not. They existed in legal limbo, neither fully family members nor fully independent, and many discovered this only when their foster parents died and they received nothing. The New York Foundling Hospital represented the Catholic response to Protestant domination of child placement. Founded October 11, 1869, by Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon and two other Sisters of Charity, the hospital opened with $5 in starting capital in a small house at 17 East 12th Street. On the first night, they received their first baby, a girl named Sarah. By January 1st, 1870, less than 3 months later, they had received 123 babies. The Foundling focused on infants and toddlers, younger than the Children's Aid Society typically handled. In May 1873, they sent their first children to Catholic families in Maryland. Their trains were called baby trains or mercy trains. The process differed from the Children's Aid Society. The Foundling worked with Catholic priests in destination communities who identified approved families in advance. Children were pre-placed. Sisters sewed identification numbers into clothing with the family name and address. Families received matching cards to claim their assigned child. There was no public viewing, no selection process at the platform. By the 1910s, the Foundling was placing 1,000 children per year. The Catholic Church's involvement was not purely humanitarian. Church leadership was alarmed that the Protestant-run Children's Aid Society was placing Catholic Irish children in Protestant homes, viewed as a form of religious conversion. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., father of the future president, served as a prime trustee of the Children's Aid Society from 1867 to 1878. His cousin James R. Roosevelt continued until 1911. The Catholic community saw this as Protestant elite managing the immigrant poor. The establishment of Catholic placing out programs was defensive, an attempt to retain Catholic children within the faith. Other organizations joined the movement. The New York Juvenile Asylum, founded 1851, placed approximately 6,000 children, primarily to Illinois and Iowa. The American Female Guardian Society participated from 1865 to 1906. New England Home for Little Wanderers in Boston sent children to Michigan and elsewhere. By 1920, the Children's Aid Society and approximately 1,500 other agencies had collectively placed around 150,000 children. This was institutional infrastructure operating across decades, moving children by the trainload with minimal oversight and almost no unified record-keeping system. September 1854 to the 1870s represent the experimental phase, the working out of mechanisms through trial and error on the bodies of children. That first train to Dowagiac established the template but also revealed immediate problems. Agent E.P. Smith gave 2 children to random passengers during the journey without any background investigation. He added a boy from an Albany railroad yard with no verification of orphan status. 8 children remained unchosen and were forwarded to Iowa City, establishing the practice of multiple stops until all children were placed. The early trains traveled in conditions little better than cattle cars. Children spent days in transit, often not knowing their destination until they were already moving. The youngest cried constantly. The older boys, many of them hardened street children who'd survived through theft and violence, viewed the journey with suspicion. Some saw it as opportunity, a free ticket west where they could find work or simply disappear. The destinations followed railroad expansion. The 1850s saw extensive rail construction into Iowa. 5 railroads spanned the state by 1876. 95% of Iowa towns received orphan trains between 1854 and 1929. The Rock Island Railroad, Burlington and Missouri, Illinois Central, Milwaukee, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, Union Pacific, all participated. Towns were notified in advance through postmasters. Advertisements appeared in newspapers with specific arrival dates and times. An 1888 flyer from Rockford, Illinois, announced that children may be taken at first upon trial for 4 weeks, and afterwards, if all the parties are satisfied, under indenture, girls until 18 and bucks until 21 years of age. An 1893 advertisement in Tecumseh, Nebraska, specified that all children received under the care of this association are of special promise in intelligence and health, and are in age from 1 month to 12 years, and are sent free to those receiving them on 90 days' trial. It listed specific children, 8 boys, ages 10, 6, 4, blonde, English parents, very promising. The language was explicit. These were not just children. They were categorized by ethnicity, appearance, temperament, marketed like goods. Families could order specific characteristics: light babies versus dark babies, boys for farm work, girls for domestic service. The viewing process varied by location but followed general patterns. Saturday arrival was typical. Sunday, children were introduced at church services. Monday, selection occurred. In Pilot Grove, Missouri, in October, 1900, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described the scene in detail. Crowds at the station. Children paraded through the streets, gathering at the church. In Grand Island, Nebraska, in May 1912, the Daily Independent reported that some ordered boys, others girls, some preferred light babies, others dark, and the orders were filled out properly, and every new parent was delighted. The newspaper account is cheerful, but the reality underneath is transactional. Children were inventoried and distributed. Local committees, composed of town doctor, clergyman, newspaper editor, store owner, were supposed to screen prospective parents for suitability. An 1883 independent investigation, conducted with Brace's consent, found the committees ineffective at screening. Small town committee members were reluctant to reject friends or business customers as foster parents. The Minnesota State Board of Corrections and Charities review from 1880 to 83 found that children were hastily placed without proper investigation, and that local committee members were swayed by pressure from wealthy or important individuals. Older children were frequently placed with farmers who expected to profit from their labor. The investigation concluded that supervision was lax and many older boys had run away. An 1874 review of 6,000 placements in Indiana found only 5 children in state reformatories. The Children's Aid Society pointed to this as evidence of success. Critics noted that the society had no idea where most of the other children were. Official policy required annual agent visits to each placed child, twice-yearly correspondence from children, regular reports from foster families and local advisory boards. In practice, there were only a handful of agents to monitor thousands of placements across dozens of states. Reports were frequently late or missing entirely. Some children complained agents never appeared. The society guaranteed they would remove children from failed placements and return them to New York at the charity's expense. This happened occasionally, but required the child to somehow contact the society or for egregious abuse to come to official attention. Most children had no means of communication. They were isolated on farms, often miles from town, with foster parents who controlled all access to the outside world. Some thrived. John Green Brady, who rode the same train as Andrew Burke on August 2, 1859, to Tipton, Indiana, was selected by Judge John Green, who later admitted, "I considered him the homeliest, toughest, most unpromising boy in the whole lot." I had a curious desire to see what could be made of such a specimen of humanity. Brady attended Yale Divinity School, became a Presbyterian minister, co-founded Sheldon Jackson College in Alaska, and served as governor of Alaska Territory from 1897 to 1906, appointed by President McKinley and reappointed by Theodore Roosevelt. When President Roosevelt visited Alaska in 1900, Brady told him, "Your father picked me up on the streets of New York, a waif and an orphan, and sent me to a Western family. I can never repay what he did for me." Andrew Burke, Brady's friend from that same train, became governor of North Dakota from 1890 to 92. These are the success stories the Children's Aid Society featured in annual reports and fundraising appeals. They were real. They were also exceptional. The 1880s through 1910s marked the acceleration phase, when the movement operated at industrial scale and its problems became systemically visible. Between 1880 and 1900, 11 million new immigrants entered the United States. New York's population of homeless children fluctuated between 20,000 and 30,000. The Children's Aid Society responded by increasing volume. In 1875, peak year, they placed 4,026 children. The New York Foundling Hospital, by the 1910s, placed 1,000 children annually. Other organizations contributed thousands more. The trains ran constantly. Entire towns in the Midwest came to expect them. Cooper County, Missouri, received multiple trains. Mason City, Iowa, documented arrivals in 1871, 1889, and 1913, totaling approximately 36 children. Northwood, Iowa, received 2 trains in July and September 1913 with 14 and 12 children respectively. The geographic scope expanded beyond initial Midwest focus. By 1910, 47 states had received children, plus the District of Columbia and Indian Territory. Canada took 566 documented cases. Mexico received placements, though specific numbers are unclear. Initially, southern states were excluded because Brace was an ardent abolitionist who wouldn't send children to slave states. After the Civil War, southern placements resumed. However, abolitionists opposed the program precisely because they viewed it as recreating slavery. After emancipation, families that had relied on enslaved labor now sought unpaid child labor from orphan trains. The accusation was not entirely unfounded. An 1880 editorial in Indiana stated bluntly, "Children so thrown out from the cities are a source of much corruption in the country places where they are thrown. Very few such children are useful." At the 1874 National Prison Reform Congress, a Wisconsin delegate complained about criminal children being dumped in his state. Between 1875 and 76, delegates from Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana joined the complaint. The charge was that New York used the trains to export its problems west. The Children's Aid Society responded that most children were of good character, but the criticism had enough basis that it led to the key. First, restrictive legislation. Michigan passed the first law in 1895, requiring institutions to post bonds with local judges for each child placed. 1887. Michigan legislation attempted to halt out-of-state placements entirely. 1901 saw a wave of restrictions. Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, and Missouri prohibited placement of children with mental deficiencies or certain diseases. Nebraska demanded legal proof of guardianship and specified children must be formally adopted with legal documentation. Kansas required a $5,000 bond and certificates of good character, though enforcement was inconsistent. The states were asserting regulatory authority over what had been essentially unregulated private charity. The legal framework remained confused. Adoption laws existed. Massachusetts passed the first general adoption statute in 1851, but most placements were not formal adoptions. Kansas had no adoption law until 1864. Illinois codified adoption in 1867. Yet even when state laws existed, they weren't consistently applied to orphan train placements. Most children were indentured rather than adopted. The legal difference mattered profoundly. An 1871 case in McLean County, Illinois, involved Lizzie Pearson, who arrived in 1866 and was placed with James Lucas, then transferred to another guardian. When she turned 18, her indenture specified a $50 payment. Her guardians refused to pay. She sued and won. The case established that indenture contracts were legally enforceable, but it also revealed how many children never received promised payments. A judicial doctrine called equitable adoption developed specifically from orphan train cases. Johnson v. Johnson, decided by North Dakota Supreme Court in 2000, discussed this doctrine arising from oral agreements made at train platforms. If a valid contract to adopt could be proven, even without formal legal adoption, courts might grant inheritance rights. But this was remedial, retroactive, applicable only to those who had resources to file lawsuits decades later. Most did not. In practice, many children existed in permanent legal limbo. They were not adopted. They were not paid employees. They were indentured, a status uncomfortably close to bound labor. Older boys especially were sought for their work capacity. Farmers examined their arm muscles at the selection process. Girls were taken for domestic service or to replace dead daughters. The line between family placement and labor exploitation was not always clear. An 1884 investigation concluded that older children were frequently placed with farmers who expected to profit from their labor. The Children's Aid Society defended the arrangement by arguing that work was educational, that farm labor taught discipline and self-reliance. This was ideologically consistent with Brace's philosophy, that idleness bred crime, and that productive labor was moral reformation. But it also meant that children as young as 10 were working dawn to dusk with no compensation beyond room and board. Linda McCaffrey, professor at Barton County Community College, described some placements as strictly slave farm labor. That assessment is harsh, but not unsupported by the record. The Society's own 1810 survey reported that 8% of placed children returned to New York and 5% died, disappeared, or were arrested. That leaves 13% accounted failures even by the Society's generous definition. 87% were classified as done well, meaning they grew into creditable members of society. What this actually meant is unclear. It did not mean 87% were happy or well treated. It meant they didn't end up in prison or dead that the Society knew of. The follow-up was inadequate to establish more than that. The 1920s brought the movement to a close. Multiple converging factors made the system unsustainable. The first was professionalization of social work. In the 1890s, sociology and social work became recognized academic fields. Training programs expanded during World War I. Standards of welfare practice changed, becoming more scientific, less religious, more bureaucratic. Professional social workers criticized the orphan train model as outdated and harmful. The 1909 White House Conference on Children, called by President Theodore Roosevelt in January, brought 200 attendees from across the country to consider care of dependent children. Roosevelt stated, "Surely nothing ought to interest our people more than the care of the children who are destitute and neglected but not delinquent." The conference reached 9 major conclusions, the most significant being that poverty alone should not be reason for removing children from families. This was direct repudiation of the orphan train philosophy. Instead, the conference recommended financial support to keep families intact, expanded foster care with proper oversight, and improved adoption agencies with legal protections. The Federal Children's Bureau was established in 1912 with Julia Lathrop of Hull House as first chief, mandated to investigate infant mortality, orphanages, juvenile delinquency, and child labor. Between 1911 and 1913, 20 state legislatures adopted mothers' pension programs providing financial aid to widows and destitute families so children could remain home. Tenement reforms, daycare programs, in-home assistance through organizations like Hull House all aimed to preserve families rather than separate them. This represented philosophical shift in social welfare from removal to support. The orphan trains had always operated on the assumption that urban poverty was so corrupting that children must be extracted entirely. Progressive-era reform argued instead for addressing root causes of poverty. Simultaneously, economic conditions in the Midwest changed. The Great Depression and Dust Bowl meant farming communities could no longer absorb additional children. Demand for farm labor decreased with mechanization. Westward expansion had slowed. The frontier was declared closed in 1890. The land that had seemed infinite in 1854 was now settled. Towns that had once welcomed child labor now had their own orphan populations to support. State legislation increasingly restricted out-of-state placement. By 1929, agreements between New York charities and Western states, which had required large bonds as security, expired and were not renewed. Child labor laws and compulsory education requirements made it illegal to work children the way 19th century farms had. The system lost both its supply-side justification and its demand-side market. The New York Foundling Hospital ended placements in 1927, shifting to in-state foster care. The Children's Aid Society redirected energies toward improving child care services within New York. May 31, 1929, the last train departed New York for Sulphur Springs, Texas. The stock market crash 6 months later ensured it would never resume. 75 years of mass child migration ended not with dramatic closure, but with bureaucratic expiration. The legal agreements lapsed. The funding model collapsed. The social consensus that had supported it evaporated. The trains stopped running. Lee Nyling was 8 or 9 years old in March 1926 when he was sent west with his brothers Leo, 6, and Gerald, 3. Born Alton Lou Clement, he lost his mother when he was 7. Someone decided the 3 boys should be placed out. The journey from New York to Texas lasted days. Lee and Leo stayed together initially, but Gerald was chosen quickly by a couple and taken away. Lee witnessed other siblings separated with loud sobbing. At the first placement, Lee was rejected after 2 weeks. He moved to multiple homes before Ben and Ollie Nailing adopted him in Texas and gave him their surname. He did not reunite with his brothers until late in adult life. He died in March 2001. His story became the book Orphan Train Rider One Boy's True Story by Andrea Warren, which won the Boston Globe Horn Book Award. His testimony is the most completely documented individual case, preserved because he survived long enough to tell it and because a researcher cared enough to record it. Most children were not so lucky. Thomas, an 8-year-old boy sent from New York House of Refuge in 1880, was separated from his brother William at placement. William found a good home. Thomas was exploited for labor and abused. They reunited as adults in New York. The record doesn't specify what happened in the intervening years, how Thomas survived, whether anyone intervened, whether he ever contacted the society that placed him. Nettie and Nellie Enns were twin sisters separated upon arrival. Nettie remembered her sister being hit with a snake-handled whip after falling and breaking a dish. The anonymous father, whose story was collected by researchers, whose name is not recorded, recalled bitterness his entire life about the experience. He and his siblings were farmed out to different families and all treated terribly. His aunt's arm was broken. At Christmas, the farmer's children received presents. He received none. The farmer's children were fed and clothed well. He barely ate. He told his children these stories, and they remembered enough to preserve them, but his name and the location and the specific year are lost. Sophia, mother of a woman named Renee, who testified decades later, was subjected to severe abuse by her adoptive mother, Anna Grime, flogged with a leather-handled whip. Sophia didn't forgive Anna until age 96, when she visited the cemetery to finally forgive her. Hazel Latimer, who rode a train in 1918, recalled decades later, "That was an ordeal that no child should go through. She was examined like a horse by a farmer with old dirty hands who checked her teeth. She was treated more as workhorse than daughter." These testimonies come from survivors who lived long enough to speak and found researchers willing to listen. They represent a fraction of the total. The vast majority of children left no record, or their records were destroyed, or they died before anyone asked them what happened. The Children's Aid Society claimed in 1910 that 87% had done well. This was based on reports from local committees and foster families with every incentive to report success. Independent investigations consistently found supervision inadequate. The 1883 investigation noted many older boys had run away. Running away was itself a form of testimony. If conditions were good, why run? 80% of placement changes were initiated by the young men themselves, seeking better wages or escaping intolerable situations. The society interpreted this as evidence of American mobility and entrepreneurial spirit. It could also be interpreted as evidence that initial placements were frequently unsatisfactory. Some children undeniably benefited. Andrew Burke and John Brady became governors. Tens of thousands served in the armed forces, became farmers, clerks, teachers, productive citizens by any conventional measure. The estimated success rate is approximately 50% found genuinely good homes with loving families. 50% experienced exploitation, abuse, multiple placements, or simply disappeared. That ratio is neither triumph nor catastrophe. It is both. The movement saved some children from death by disease, starvation, or street violence in New York. It subjected others to agricultural servitude and family separation with no legal recourse. Both things are true simultaneously. The evidence does not permit simplification. The question of whether the orphan trains were good or bad is the wrong question. The right question is what they reveal about how societies decide what to do with the poor children. The movement operated on several premises that should be examined separately. First, the premise that family placement is superior to institutional care. This premise has been vindicated by modern child welfare research. Children do better in families than in large congregate institutions. Charles Loring Brace was correct about that. The problem was not the premise, but the implementation. Placing children in families without adequate screening, legal protection, or follow-up is not family care. It is abandonment with extra steps. Second, the premise that work is rehabilitative. This premise is ideologically loaded. Brace believed idleness bred crime, and that farm labor taught discipline. This was class prejudice disguised as social science. Wealthy children were not sent to farms to learn discipline through physical labor. They were sent to schools. Poor children were sent to farms because their labor was valuable and their education was considered unnecessary. The distinction matters because it exposes the movement not as rescue, but as social control, the management of a population considered dangerous. Brace titled his book The Dangerous Classes for a reason. He saw poor immigrant children as potential revolutionaries who might burn the city unless they were dispersed and disciplined. The solution was geographic and ideological. Remove them from a poor urban concentration where they might organize, distribute them across the West where they would be isolated and supervised, transform them through Protestant work ethic into individualistic farmers rather than collective urban mob. This was social engineering at scale, conducted by private charity without democratic accountability. Third, the premise that children were better off with any family than on the streets. This premise is empirically questionable. Some children on the streets survived and eventually found work or returned to family. Some children placed on farms were worked to exhaustion or beaten. The comparison is not between family and street, but between bad conditions and different bad conditions. The relevant question is not which was worse in abstract, but whether the system included mechanisms for children to choose or to leave bad situations. It did not. Once placed, children had no legal right to leave and often no practical means to do so. They were indentured until age 18 or 21. Running away meant becoming a fugitive. The society could remove them, but the society rarely knew conditions were bad unless egregious abuse became public. The system depended entirely on the benevolence of individual foster families, with no enforcement mechanism if benevolence failed. Fourth, the premise that religious placement didn't matter, or that Protestant placement was actively beneficial. This premise was bigotry. The Children's Aid Society was explicitly Protestant. Brace was a minister. Annual reports are filled with references to Christian homes, meaning Protestant homes. Irish Catholic children were systematically placed in Protestant families for the explicit purpose of religious conversion. The Catholic Church's opposition was not paranoia. It was accurate assessment of Protestant intent. The establishment of Catholic placing out programs through New York Foundling Hospital represented defensive action to prevent what was effectively religious and cultural erasure. The 1904 Arizona incident, where 40 white children were placed with Mexican Catholic families and then forcibly removed by Anglo vigilantes because white children shouldn't live with Mexicans, reveals the racial and religious politics underlying the system. The Arizona Supreme Court ruled the white families should keep the children. The supposed best interests of the child were subordinated to racial ideology. The movement as a whole reflected and reinforced contemporary prejudices about class, ethnicity, religion, and race. It was not neutral rescue. It was shaped by who had power and who didn't. Fifth, the premise that geographic separation from birth families was beneficial or necessary. This premise has been thoroughly rejected by modern child welfare practice. The 1909 White House Conference concluded that children should remain with birth families whenever possible, and that when removal was necessary, children should be placed nearby so family contact could continue. The orphan trains did the opposite. They transported children hundreds or thousands of miles from origin, often with no plan for family contact. Siblings were separated routinely. Lee Nailing and his brothers were split up and didn't reunite until adulthood. The 3-year-old girl who arrived in Columbus, Nebraska, with her name sewn into her dress hem, was separated from her older brother and didn't see him again for 70 years, reuniting only because of an Unsolved Mysteries television episode in 1988. Carl E. Nelson, aged 10 in 1900, whose father died September 14th and who boarded a train September 21st, spent 2 years from 1910 to 12 writing letters trying to find his siblings and mother. He asked, "And haven't you got no record of Mr. Nelson's children's? Send me their addresses, for I would like to find them so bad. And my mother too." The separation was not incidental. It was systematic. The movement operated on the assumption that poor families were so dysfunctional that children must be completely severed from them. This assumption was class prejudice. Some families were genuinely abusive or absent. Others were simply poor. Poverty was criminalized, and the punishment was family destruction. The movement cannot be separated from its context of mass immigration, nativism, anti-Catholic bigotry, and the absence of any social safety net. Between 1840 and 1900, America underwent unprecedented demographic transformation. Cities grew explosively. Industrial capitalism created wealth for some and misery for many. There was no unemployment insurance, no social security, no food assistance, no public health care. When families faced economic catastrophe, children starved or died of disease. Private charity was the only option, and private charity operated according to the values and prejudices of those who controlled it. Wealthy Protestant elites who believed poverty resulted from moral failure and that the solution was moral reformation through work, discipline, and religious instruction. The orphan trains were entirely consistent with that worldview. They failed not because the people running them were malicious, but because the worldview itself was inadequate. You cannot solve structural poverty through individual moral reformation. You cannot replace social policy with train tickets. You cannot substitute family separation for economic support. The movement declined when progressive-era reformers recognized these limitations and began constructing the modern welfare state with mothers' pensions, labor protections, and public assistance. The train stopped running when society developed alternative responses to child poverty. The fact that it took 75 years and the displacement of 200,000 children to reach that conclusion is the actual indictment. The immediate consequences were measured in displaced lives and altered demographics. 200,000 children, by most estimates, were transported over 75 years. Approximately 1 in 4 Iowans can trace ancestry to an orphan train rider. 1 in 25 Americans has some connection. An estimated 2 to 3 million living descendants exist today. The movement permanently changed the population distribution of the Midwest. Entire towns have residents who arrived as orphan train children. Kansas received 5 to 6,000. Minnesota received 5 to 6,000. Missouri took over 6,000. Iowa received 10,000. Michigan took 12,500. The children carried names, languages, cultural practices, and genetic lineages from New York immigrant communities into rural Anglo-Protestant America. The assimilation was not seamless. Riders recalled being mocked for their accents, for being Irish, for being Catholic, for being orphans. Some families loved them, others worked them. The outcomes varied by individual case, but the aggregate effect was the redistribution of the urban poor into the countryside, where they were absorbed, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, into the dominant culture. The long-term consequences included the development of modern foster care. The Children's Aid Society's basic insight that children are better cared for by families than in institutions became foundational to 20th century child welfare. The criticisms of the orphan trains, especially regarding religious matching, legal protections, and follow-up, led directly to reforms. The 1912 Federal Children's Bureau, the 1935 Social Security Act, which provided funding for child welfare services, the development of professional social work standards all emerged partly in response to the inadequacies of the orphan train system. The movement demonstrated at scale what happened when private charity attempted to solve social problems without regulation, legal framework, or accountability. The lesson learned, eventually, was that child welfare requires public responsibility, legal protections, professional standards, and ongoing oversight. These principles are now embedded in state and federal child welfare law. The movement's legacy is also preserved institutionally. The Orphan Train Heritage Society of America was founded in 1986 by Mary Ellen Johnson, a publisher's assistant in Springdale, Arkansas, who learned that an orphan train had delivered children to her town in 1912. She interviewed survivors and discovered no organization existed to preserve their history. She created one. The society serves as clearinghouse of information, publishes orphan train riders, their own stories in multiple volumes, hosts annual reunions in 12 states. The National Orphan Train Complex opened in Concordia, Kansas, in the restored Union Pacific Railroad Depot, now on the National Register of Historic Places. It houses museum exhibits, research archives with approximately 8,000 rider records, and an actual train car. It is open Tuesday through Friday, 10 to noon and 1 to 4, and Saturdays, 10 to 4. Admission is $10 for adults. The Louisiana Orphan Train Museum opened in Opelousas in 2009 in a restored freight depot. These institutions exist because survivors and descendants demanded recognition. For decades, being an orphan train rider carried stigma. Many riders never told their children they were ashamed or traumatized or simply wanted to forget. The reunion movement began in 1962 when Nebraska riders held their first annual gathering in Grand Island. 2 nuns and a priest from New York Foundling Hospital attended. The gatherings allowed aging riders to share experiences, search for separated siblings, and insist that their history mattered. Beatrice Flanagan Fosdick, adopted in Sealy, Texas, at 14 months old, is believed to be the last living rider as of 2023, at age 93. When she dies, the movement will pass entirely into history, dependent on archival records, museum exhibits, and descendants to preserve memory. The archival records are substantial but incomplete. The New York Historical Society holds the Victor Reamer Historical Archives of the Children's Aid Society, including annual reports from 1853 through 2006, case files, agent diaries, photographs. The New York Foundling Hospital records span 1869 through 2009. Many files involving specific children remain restricted. Access requires permission. The American Female Guardian Society surrender books from 1880 to 1930 have been digitized through Family Search. Clark Kidder, an independent researcher, has compiled 6 volumes on New York juvenile asylum history with access to records, but thousands of children left no records at all. They were taken from streets with no documentation. Their names were misspelled or changed. They disappeared into the Midwest and never wrote back. Their stories are lost. The movement's history is necessarily incomplete, recovered from fragments, survivor testimony, newspaper accounts, and institutional records created by the organizations that moved the children, records with inherent bias toward reported successes. The absence of comprehensive data is itself evidence of the system's failure to track outcomes or prioritize children's welfare over organizational image. May 31st, 1929. The last train departs New York for Sulphur Springs, Texas. The children on that train have no idea they are the last. They experience the same fear and confusion as the first children 75 years earlier, the same sense of being moved by forces beyond their control toward destinations unknown. By the time they arrive, the stock market is 6 months from collapse, and the country is sliding toward depression. The era that made orphan trains possible, the era of railroad expansion and agricultural labor demand, and progressive era certainty that social problems could be solved through moral uplift and geographic redistribution, is ending. The children scatter into Texas and the records lose track of them. Some probably had good lives, some probably didn't. We don't know, and we have no way to know because the system never built mechanisms to track them. That is the final lesson. A social intervention that moves 200,000 children across 75 years and cannot say with certainty what happened to most of them is not a success. It is an experiment conducted without control group, without follow-up, without accountability on human beings who had no choice in the matter. The trains that scattered children across America did not solve urban poverty. They relocated it. The dangerous classes did not disappear. They were dispersed and obscured. Some individual children were saved. Others were harmed. Most survived and made what lives they could with what they were given. Their descendants are here, millions of them, living evidence of the movement's demographic impact. The movement ended because society developed better options, public welfare, labor protections, family preservation, professional social work. The train stopped when we decided there might be alternatives to separating poor children from their families and sending them away to be raised by strangers. That realization took 75 years. It came too late for Lee Niling searching for his brothers. Too late for Carl Nelson writing letters begging for addresses of siblings. Too late for Thomas, exploited and abused. Too late for the 8-year-old boy added from an Albany railroad yard with no record of his name. Too late for the thousands whose names we don't know, who boarded trains as children and stepped off into lives unrecorded, unmourned, and now irretrievable, except as aggregate statistics in annual reports that list them as successes or failures based on criteria they never agreed to. The platform at Dowagiac is empty now. The Presbyterian meeting house where children stood in 1854 is gone or repurposed. The trains run on different schedules for different reasons. The system that put 46 children on a platform at 3 in the morning and distributed them to strangers is illegal now. prohibited by the same state laws and federal regulations that emerged from recognition of its failures. What remains is the historical record, incomplete and contested, and the living descendants, and the question of what we owe to the memory of children who were moved across the country because adults decided it was for the best without asking them and without knowing whether it was true. The answer is that we owe them accuracy. We owe them the refusal to simplify their experience into redemption narrative or simple condemnation. We owe them the acknowledgement that the orphan trains were neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but were both simultaneously, that they saved some children and harmed others, that they were motivated by genuine humanitarian concern and by class prejudice and religious bigotry, that they pioneered concepts still used in child welfare and also demonstrated how those concepts can fail catastrophically when implemented without safeguards. We owe them the recognition that their lives were real, not data points, and that 200,000 individual stories, most now lost, constituted the actual substance of the movement that history has reduced to statistics and generalizations. The trains scattered them, and we cannot gather them back. But we can refuse to scatter them further into myth. We can insist on the documented facts, the dated events, the named individuals, the specific places, the preserved testimonies. We can resist the impulse to make the story simpler than it was. That is what remains to be done, and that is what this account has attempted, to present what the evidence shows without suppressing the contradictions or resolving the ambiguities that the historical record itself will not resolve. The children on the trains had no choice. We have the choice to remember them accurately. That is the least we owe, and perhaps all we can offer.